All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming, making your way in. I know some of you walked here this morning. Some came from as far as Brockville, I think, was the farthest we've got somebody coming from this morning, unless anybody flew in. So appreciate your time. I think it's going to be a valuable session. We're going to break it up into sort of three parts. The first, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of corporate PPAs. I'm going to start it from sort of the beginning, PPAs 101, because I think we've got a fairly diverse range of experience with PPAs in the room. Some people with organizations that have actually done a few, some who are just learning about it really for the first time. So probably part of the reason you're here this morning is you've seen news articles like this. So lots of deals being done in the United States where corporate entities or other organizations are signing long-term power purchase agreements for renewables, mainly wind, but more and more solar as well. In fact, a couple of the companies that are up on this list are here today. So this is it's a real trend. Often the hype is not consistent with the data, but the data in this case actually shows that it is a growing trend. So this is data put out by the Business Renewables Center, based out of the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado. They track all of the power purchase agreements that are done in the US. And if we look at the trend, you'll see a bit of a dip from 2015 to 2016. This is a bit artificial. In the United States, there's a 30% investment tax credit that you can get when you build a renewable facility. Essentially drops the price of building that by 30%. That was set to expire at the end of 2015. So a lot of deals were signed to try to get in under the wire before that did. So deals you might have seen naturally happen in 2016 or early 2017 got pulled forward into 2015. If we normalize for that, more of a smooth curve upward. To sort of quantify what 6.5 gigawatts of power means from last year, that's about enough power to supply electricity to 1 million homes. So a significant amount of new deals signed last year. One of the other key trends that we see is a lot of big blocks in the early years, right? So very large scale deals being done for hundreds of megawatts with a single company taking the entire deal. As we move into 2018, you'll see increasing numbers of the sort of small slices in the graph, right? So as we move beyond the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks with sort of giant data centers that can take hundreds of megawatts at one time, a GM that can do a 200 megawatt deal for 6 or 7 facilities across a couple of states, even relatively large companies, these are all Fortune 500 companies for the most part that are in these small tranches. This is, Starbucks is on there, GM has actually got a slice on there for a couple of their plants, Nestle, Cargill. They're combining with other companies to get one project built. In the industry, they call that aggregation. I think maybe from your perspective, maybe think of it as a buyer group, but you're seeing more and more 3, 4, 5 organizations combining to get one plant built because these plants produce a lot of electricity. To get the kind of pricing that becomes interesting for you to buy, you've got to build them at very large scale. And to build them at that scale, you get beyond what most companies use on their own. So that's a very key trend in the marketplace. Most of these deals are what's called virtual power purchase agreements. So let's talk about what a virtual power purchase agreement is versus a physical one. So you're building an off-site renewable energy project being built maybe in a farming area, maybe in the desert, somewhere that's not heavily populated. Could be wind or solar. This project is going to sell its power into the local power grid. So one key thing to understand is these deals are happening and the projects are being built where there's a deregulated wholesale electricity market, where you can be an independent power producer, build a project, sell your power into the grid, as opposed to other places where you've got a regulated utility that's essentially a monopoly that's dictating what gets built, what gets distributed, what gets transmitted. So in that kind of market, you build a project, you sell your power into it, and you get whatever the market price is, essentially, for that power. That will fluctuate based on supply demand, hour to hour, season to season, year to year. The local utility then buys that power, and they send the energy to you, the energy buyer. One other key thing to understand is that you're still going to be paying your utility in these deals the same as if you had never signed a renewable energy deal. So you're still paying your Toronto Hydro, your Electra, whatever bill that is you normally pay. It's unaffected by the renewable energy deal that you're doing. So what actually happens is that because this off-site renewable energy project that you're going to contract with is only getting the market price, you're going to help them to get financing and get this thing built by providing them with certainty on their revenue. So if you're going to be building a 20-year, 30-year asset and you're selling that on a merchant basis, whatever the market gives you, that's a hard project to get built. Prices are very variable. Getting financing for that is difficult. It gets very expensive to get the financing for that, which might ruin the economics of the project. So the buyer's key role is in guaranteeing a price to the generator of that electricity over a period of time. So no matter what happens to this wholesale electricity price, they're going to get the same price at the end of the day. And it's the buyer who's guaranteeing them that price. We'll go over the mechanism for that in a moment. What the buyer gets in return is renewable energy certificates. You get the right to say we are buying green energy, regardless of what your utility is actually sourcing and giving you. By having the renewable energy certificates from that wind or solar project, you can declare that you are 50, 75, 100% renewable powered, whatever the ratio of those renewable energy certificates is to your total energy consumption. One other key to think about is the dynamic of this if you're procuring in the same market as where the project is located versus doing it outside that market. Because this is just a financial mechanism, you could build a project anywhere that's got a deregulated market and apply those renewable energy certificates to load that you have anywhere else in the country. And this is actually fairly common in the US. So you see somebody build a large wind farm or solar farm in Texas or Oklahoma, where the deregulated market and the pricing is quite favorable. And then they apply that to their national load, for example. But there's a big and important difference to understand. If you're building it and consuming it in the same place, you've got a natural hedge, which means that if the wholesale power revenue, that the price of power that renewable facility is getting is low, and you are paying them, you're also going to benefit because the price of your energy is going to go down by the same amount. So you're going to pay on the top end, but you're going to save on the bottom end, and you end up balancing it out. If, however, you are buying it in a different location than it's being produced, you could see power prices go up in one jurisdiction, down in the other, or vice versa. So you could end up saving a lot, or you could end up paying a lot. And that's one of the risks that we want to talk about today. So in the Canadian context, really the only functioning wholesale power market is in Alberta. And in Alberta today, we're seeing pricing that enables these kind of deals to get built. So we looked at the previous US chart that said, in 2014, 15, lots of projects starting to get built, but they had that 30% investment tax credit we don't have in Canada. Prices of renewables have been dropping by 8 or 10% a year, so we're 3 or 4 years behind them. So now in Alberta, it's starting to make sense to do this from a financial basis. And if you build that project in Alberta, because it's a financial settlement, if you have facilities in Calgary, but also in Saskatoon or in Toronto and Halifax, you can apply that renewable energy buy to really anywhere across Canada. So you can cover your national load if you want to. However, you've got a natural hedge in Alberta. You don't necessarily have that. You've got some price risk outside of Alberta. One of the great things about building in the Alberta market is the impact that you can have. So this is a view of the current mix of electricity generation in the province of Alberta. Bit of wind, bit of hydro, largely fossil fuels, close to 80%. So over the next 10 years, all of that coal has to retire. There's a federal mandate to retire that. So regardless of the fact that we've just had a change in government provincially in Alberta, we're still going to see this coal retire over the next decade. The question is, what's going to replace it? It could be more gas, and that would be probably the default. A lot of the generators who own these coal assets also own gas-fired power plants. They can convert the coal plants to gas plants, they get lower capacity out of it, so there's going to be room to replace them with something else anyway. It creates about probably 5 gigawatts of room in Alberta to build new renewables, which you compare to what happened in the US last year, almost that same amount, right? So enough for maybe 800, 900,000 homes. And when you look at what can happen if we do avoid coal to gas and we move that to coal to renewables, it gives us the opportunity for a real decarbonization. Natural gas still has, call it, half of the carbon footprint of coal. In electricity, we know how to get to zero. Many of you probably know in your industrial processes, it's hard to get the carbon out of process heat. It's hard to get it out of other industrial processes. In electricity, we know what to do. So if we're going to reach our 2030 goals, electricity is one of the places where we've got to make real progress, and Alberta is the place where that progress can be made today in Canada. It's by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases among all of the electricity grids in the country. Okay. So let's talk about the mechanics of how this works. So chart up here shows 3 different scenarios, depending on what happens with the wholesale power prices. So you are the buyer, and you're going to go to the wind or solar plant, and you're going to say, I'm going to guarantee you're going to get $55 a megawatt hour for your power. No matter what happens to the wholesale power price in Alberta, which goes up and down all the time, I'm going to guarantee you're going to get $55, about 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour, if you want to think about it that way. So scenario 1 is the actual price of power, they call it the pool price in Alberta, is coming in lower than that. It's coming in at $45. So what happens is this gap, this $10 a megawatt hour, is your responsibility. You now have to remit that to the generator to keep them whole. So they're getting $45 from the pool, they're getting $10 from you, they've got their $55, and their project is getting the revenue stream that it needs. So that's scenario 1. So you've got a power pool price of 45, buyer pays 10, generator gets 55. Scenario 2 is straightforward. They got the $55 that they needed from the pool, the buyer doesn't know anything, the buyer doesn't receive anything. Pretty straightforward. Scenario number 3 is the one that everybody, I think, wants, right? A lot of the reason people are sitting in the room here, which is they got $65 from the pool. Power prices were higher than the guaranteed price. So not only do you get the Renewable Energy certificate, you get to say that you're renewably powered, but you get $10 back at the same time on every megawatt of power that was generated. So any of these can happen, and this is actually recorded on an hour-by-hour basis because that's the way power is actually priced. And then you settle it up. It could be monthly, it could be quarterly. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to settle, do I owe you money or do you owe me money as the buyer versus the generator? So with this sort of mechanism, let's have a look at, in the Alberta Power pool, one more, what do prices actually look like? Would you end up paying or would you end up making money on the deal? In the last 18 months or so, the government has actually gone and procured renewable electricity 3 times. They call it the Renewable Energy Procurement, or REP. They've had 3 rounds of it, about 3 projects in each round. And you'll see that the pricing that they've gotten out of those rounds is between $38 and $40, say, per megawatt hour. This is contracting on exactly the same basis as that mechanism we just described. Contract for difference. So they are guaranteeing the generator to get about $40, no matter what happens to the pool price. They may end up having to pay, they may end up getting money back. And you'll see that compared to last year's prices, looks like a good deal, right? $50 was the average price on the pool. They're now contracting going forward at $40. So at sort of first glance, it looks like Alberta government's in good shape. They're going to make about $10 per megawatt hour. They're going to save $10 per megawatt hour on their electricity costs, should the pool price stay where it is. There are a few caveats with that, though, that I want to point out for you that are important for you to take away today. Number 1 is that clearly that's not always the price of power. This is a 5-year view, and if we look back further than that, we'd see some higher prices than this. But in the last 5 years, we have seen some anomalies in the market, combination of recession in Alberta, but also retirement of some coal assets and some unusual behavior with those, that drove the power price down to $18 and change in 2016. So had the government had this contract in place at that time, they guarantee them $40, pool price is 18, it's now costing $22 a megawatt hour, 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour, above the normal price to procure that renewable energy. So there's some risk from year to year, depending on what just happens with the supply and demand dynamics in the marketplace, as to what your pricing is going to be on that renewable deal. So this is a graph of what it looks like on hour-to-hour pricing. So the numbers along the bottom are the hours of the year, up to 8,760 hours during the course of the year. Every bar is an individual hours pricing. And there's huge variability, right? So the price can range between $0 and $1,000. It's like $1 a kilowatt hour, 10 times what you might pay at home for electricity. And you'll see that it's not uncommon for the price to reach $1,000 over the course of a year, several times. And many, many times, it's over $200, especially in the summertime, when you've got high demand, and sometimes the wind isn't blowing. The wind is actually a fairly material impact on pricing in Alberta, even though it's only about 10% of the market. When you think about things like the oil price and one country's production gets cut back and the price of oil goes way up, very similar dynamic with electricity pricing. If the wind's not blowing, even though it's only maybe 10% of the market, it's that sort of marginal 10% that has a big impact, and prices really spike up. So if you're a wind producer, you're tending to get the pricing down here. And you're not typically getting the pricing up here because those spikes in price are actually caused by the fact that wind isn't producing at that time. Conversely, if you're a solar producer, this is exactly the time when you're producing the most, in the middle of the summer. And so you're getting the benefit from pretty much all of those spikes. So you might be getting $30 or $40 most of the year, but every once in a while you get $300, $500, $900, which really helps the economics. So, to Craig's question, you can't produce solar quite as cheaply as wind. You won't get a solar contract at $40 a megawatt hour. The most recent big deal that was done in Alberta was for the government's own facilities. They signed a solar PPA to power their own provincial buildings, etc. That came in at $55 a megawatt hour. Still a great price, not as low as wind. However, wind gets a 30% discount to the average price. So we saw in 2018, if we go back up, that the average price in 2018, all resources, 24/7, 365 was $50. Wind only got $35 on average over the course of the year. Solar got $65 because it was producing at the right time of year. So wind looks like a better deal on the face of it, 40 versus 55. But in the way these contracts work, if you bought wind, you're owing money because you're paying 40 and they sold for 35. If you had bought solar, you're making money because it cost you 55, they got 65, you got $10 back. So it's a little counterintuitive. You need to dig down a little bit and understand. And this gets into why pretty much every deal done in the US on that chart we saw has an advisor attached to it, because there's a lot that's detailed on what market are you playing in, what do the power pool prices look like, what does the shape of those look like, what does that shape look like versus your consumption shape, etc., that you really need to dig down into the analytics to see whether this is a good deal for you or not. So this is kind of the process. Because it is risky, because it is complicated, this process can actually take, on average, 18 months, is what people say in the US. The first deal, I talked to the Walmart person down at the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance conference a couple of months ago. They said it took 2 years to do their first deal, to walk through this process. And a lot of that was because you can get through understanding your load pretty quickly, and you can go run an RFP relatively quickly. But at some point, you've got to get C-suite approval, initially and finally, and your CFO and your board's risk management committee, they're going to want to understand all of this stuff. You're signing up for something that can be rather open-ended. You've got large numbers of megawatt hours. On every megawatt hour, you've got an exposure of X dollars, and then that's all over potentially 20 years in some of these deals. So you multiply those three things together, and you've got tens of millions of dollars of value at risk, as they call it. So this tends to attract the attention of the CFO and those on their team. So you've got to sort of have everything locked down before you bring this forward. And that's sort of the value that we want to help bring to your organization is what's the information that your CFO is going to want from an analytical basis, from a due diligence basis, knowing that you've run a good RFP, you've got not only the best pricing out there, but you've got a reliable counterparty, you've got a developer that's actually going to get this project built. That's the kind of intelligence we can help you with. So Bullfrog is a founder member of Business Renewable Centre Canada. So that orange chart I showed at the beginning that showed everything that's gotten built in the US, that was produced by the BRC USA. They've just expanded to Canada, setting up shop in Calgary. The official launch is coming in September. We're one of the founding members, and as far as advisory goes, so we've got a lawyer, we've got sort of a back-end technology provider who we're actually working with, and on the advisory side, it's us. There are a few developers there. Whether those are the right developers to work with, there are more than 70 projects, wind and solar, of 50 megawatts or more in the queue in Alberta. There's a lot to choose from. There's some good ones here. There are lots of other ones as well. There are good ones, there are bad ones. Sorting out which are the more attractive and which aren't is going to be one of the keys for you as a buyer going forward. That's sort of the fundamentals, I'll say. Thanks for all the questions. Thanks for your engagement.